there is a nation called Israel. Historically, there's no reason why there should be, other than the faithfulness and the grace of God, and the fact that God had a sovereign plan that started with Him calling Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees to bring about a blessing to all families and a seed that would be for salvation of all people. And God doesn't fail in His promises. And I'm so very thankful for that. We've seen that time and time again. And no doubt in the course of this, we're going to see a lot more of that. Really, as I'm going through this, and those who might be historians in here tonight, you might hear some of the things I'm talking about and think, boy, he's really skipping over large chunks here. And then some of you might be sitting here thinking, I think he's covered every detail that happened on earth during all of these hundreds of years. I assure you I'm not covering all the details, even of Israel's history and things like that. Last Wednesday night we were talking about the intertestamental period. And what I'm really trying to do is not cover every detail of the history along the way, but details that are biblically pertinent to the fact that the nation of Israel exists and how God is accomplishing His purposes through that nation and in every time period. So last week, while we did cover a lot of intertestamental history, the standouts of that history was the Grecian Empire, who brought a common language to most peoples of the earth, and the beginnings of the Roman Empire that built roads all over the earth and really made travel significantly easier than it had been before. And I believe in my heart that all of this was God's means of allowing a greater ease of the message that would come out of Jerusalem to be carried by those Jewish apostles to the uttermost part of the earth, and to be able to have common language, to be able to have easier travel, because I believe with every fiber of my being, God would have all men to be saved. He would, and God was working even during that intertestamental period to bring that about. Tonight we're going to spend just a little bit more time, not a whole lot, but a little bit more time in this intertestamental period. When I say that, I mean the period of history of 400 years in between the close of Malachi and the angel appearing unto Zacharias and telling him about a coming son who was going to be named John. And during that time, there were significant events that happened, even when God was in the background. Now, this was 2 weeks ago when we were there, because last week we dealt with mission. We got to read some missionary letters, and we're in 2 Thessalonians. But just to catch us up a little bit, we talked about a family whose last name was Maccabees, and this was a man who had a large number of sons, and basically kind of took things on his own shoulders in Judea, and made himself both king or prince, depending upon the historian that writes about it, and high priest. This really angered some of the Jews who felt like that the king and the high priest should never be one figure, that God intended for them, that office, to be divided up. And so this was it was a time period where basically the Jews as a people, or the nation of Israel, was just barely hanging on to identity. And that would be the story of that whole intertestamental period. And there were many threats to them losing their identity. There's always been threats to the Jewish people losing their identity as God's chosen people. One of the greatest threats was when they were scattered abroad. Some had been overtaken by Assyria, while some were carried off into Babylon. They were pushed to the four corners of the earth, and one might think that they would be tempted to lose their identity during that time. But the Jewish people, even in Persia, were very careful to maintain a Jewish identity, and actually a pretty strong one, so that 70 years after they went into captivity, they still had genealogies, they still practiced their religion, though away from their homeland. And when Cyrus came to power and said, all right, you're going to get to go back to your homeland, there was no question about who was qualified to go back to their homeland because of the identity for that 70 years they had maintained. As a matter of fact, history would record there might have been greater threats to their identity after they got back, after Nehemiah came home and rebuilt the walls and the gates. Because what began to happen there was, as they began to settle back into the region of Judea, and as they began to practice certain things in the temple again, there were a number of outside influences that were constantly warring against their identity as God's people. Some of them were more subtle than others, but during this time, there was never an actual kingdom. There was never really a true monarchy that would establish, but rather they would spend most of this time under the vassal leadership of other empires. And a lot of that time, several hundred years, they were under the Seleucid Empire, or some people say Seleucid, but I'm going to say Seleucid. They were under the Seleucid Empire, which brought a lot of Greek methodology and ideology to God's people. And historically, most of that is called Hellenism. And Hellenism threatened to just basically take over Judaism. And then a little bit later, Romanism would come in. And then there was Alexandrian thought from down in Egypt through the Ptolemaic Empire that had influence. And because of Israel's location, you should understand that Israel's location that God chose to put them in has always been central to the affairs of the entire world. And so any world empire that came into power looked to kind of have that area on the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean as a hub, because it was from there you could launch down into Egypt. It was from there that you could launch over into what is now Iran, Iraq, north of there being Turkey. It was just a very good area to have under your control. And so here's where God put His people. Now they're back in their homeland. They're functioning now for these 400 years. This Maccabean revolt has allowed them some freedom of independence, and yet they're still under the thumb of these other foreign empires, and there's other influences that are constantly trying to creep in. There would be Jews who were upset about the Maccabean leaders. From the Maccabean period, they would go into the Hasmonean period. It's not on the test. You don't need to worry about this. But they would go into the Hasmonean period. And that would start with the last Maccabean family leader. And it would kind of launch into another push that just opened the doors for a lot more influence. And so the high priesthood was always a matter of question. Who should be the high priest? Now remember, they've got a temple again in Jerusalem. They're resuming the practice of Old Testament Judaism in their land once again. And so there was always question throughout these hundreds of years as to who was a rightful heir to the high priesthood. And beyond that, because there was such a revolving door of political leadership during these days, there was always question about who's going to solve civil disputes. You know, when me and my neighbor get into it over if his garden is over on my side of the line or things like that, who do we go to solve these kinds of things? And so there was a group of people among the Jews who basically rose up among the Judean people to say, look, we will make it our job to rule in civil affairs and kind of be judges in matters of everyday life and policy and things like that. But here's what we're going to do. We have an identity. We're very attached to our identity as a people. And so we're going to interpret every issue that needs judged based upon the Torah, which is another word, or the Hebrew word, for the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also called the books of Moses. And so we're gonna let the law of God determine how to settle these matters. And we're pretty sure that we can find all of our answers there. So there were men that devoted themselves to be students of the Torah, of the books of the law, so that they could sit in a position where they could hear matters and settle civil and economic and social disputes and things like that. These men predominantly came to be known as rabbis. Something before that really unknown in Jewish society, but that's where this system came about. And this came about around 170 years BC. Does anyone know what BC stands for? Before Christ. All right, so about 170 years before Christ, this system kind of came into place. So here we have rabbis. These people are respected members of the community who dedicated themselves to studying the law to sit and settle disputes. Well, as is anything in government or organization, there's got to be a system, a recognized system for how this works. And so they would have kind of a court level of system, kind of a hierarchy where small civil disputes could be settled in just small civil court areas that were positioned in every city. And then regionally, there would be what was called the Lower Sanhedrin. And these were, the Lower Sanhedrin was these places where there would be 23 of these rabbis or these lawyers, also sometimes called scribes. And if a matter was too big for the local civil areas, then they would turn it over to the Lower Sanhedrin. And then, if that couldn't be settled there, the next level up was called the Great Sanhedrin. Anybody ever heard that word before? All right, here's why I'm talking about this. Because when I say that, a Bible reader would think, I've heard that. The Sanhedrin? Well, here's what the Sanhedrin was. It was the next level up, and the Sanhedrin was made up of 71 men, and each one of these men had basically been elected from one of the lower Sanhedrin to go up and sit on council for the Great Sanhedrin. And the Great Sanhedrin made principal decisions for the Judean people during this time period. As a matter of fact, if anybody was going to be put to death, that had to be a decision made in agreement by the Great Sanhedrin. And other major economic policies and decisions. And so that is why so many political leaders could come and go while the basic identity of the people remained the same. So when you've got every few years or every couple of decades over hundreds of years, you've got one brother killing his brothers so he can take over the throne and the high priesthood. Did y'all hear me? I'm not going into names, but you can study this out and you can find out that these political offices were so coveted And remember, it was combined by the Maccabees into both prince or king, so basically a government official, and then a religious official being the high priest. That was combined into one office, so you could knock off one guy and take his position to become the high priest in the service of God. And you've got all these different leaders, but what's one thing that's kind of amazing to me in studying this Jewish history, and especially during this time, how can so many political leaders not really change the identity or the direction of the people? And the reason was because these political leaders, for the most part, were willing to have the power and exercise that power with the military. There were expansions that were done during this time. There was one political leader named John Hyrcanus. And John Hyrcanus was over Judea. He went up and besieged Jericho. So the governor of Jericho tried to have him killed, was unsuccessful. So then he got his army together in Judea, went up and besieged Jericho, and eventually won over Jericho after they tortured and killed his mother. And so then he comes back to Judea, and he after his involvement as a general in the Seleucid army and all this kind of stuff, now he doesn't fit the qualifications from the Bible to be a high priest, but he makes himself a high priest anyway. And for a great many reasons, the Jewish people just really couldn't stand him, and yet he was the political leader over Judea for quite some time. And he used their army to go up and capture Samaria. And now all of a sudden the Samaritans were incorporated in Judea and Israel. A little bit later, he would journey further north and capture the region of Galilee, which was easier to do because it was a lot of blue-collar farmers and fishermen and things like that. And so he would bring Galilee, Samaria, and Judea all under the realm of Israel, which, by the way, was the condition in which Israel was in when Jesus Christ came into the world. There's some other interesting things about that intertestamental period, that with the Samaritans in this intertestamental period, they actually built their own temple in Shechem. And they practiced a religion that was virtually identical to Judaism, same beliefs, a lot of the same practices and things like that. But if you were Samaritan, you did not bother yourself to go worship in Jerusalem. That wasn't your place. You went to Shechem and you worshiped God from Shechem. Now, I'll tell you why that's kind of interesting. Because in John chapter 4, Jesus said that he must needs go through Samaria. And when he gets into a conversation with the woman at the well, and she realizes this man is a prophet, and now she's going to talk religion with him. And so she mentions this. She said, well, you're a Jew, and you say that you're supposed to worship in that mountain, and we worship in this mountain. And when Messiah comes, he's going to tell us all things. Anybody remember this conversation? Well, this kind of gives you some background to understand that the Messiah they were looking for was actually the same Messiah. That's why she would say, when Messiah comes, he's going to straighten this out for us. But until then, you worship where you worship, I'll worship where I worship, and we'll go from there. Part of that was because of decisions that were made during this intertestamental period that set the stage for Jesus coming onto the scene. So you had this great Sanhedrin that basically kept the unity of the people and preserved their Jewish identity through a lot of just wicked political leadership. There was another Antiochus who came on the scene. We talked about Antiochus Epiphanes, who went into the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar. Well, there was another Antiochus from Greek heritage that came in and ruled later on. But he was very kind to the Jews and did a lot to demonstrate that he was willing to observe their religion. Well, they never really accepted him as one of them, but they weren't nice enough to call him Antiochus the Pious. And the reason they called him Antiochus the Pious was because he was very devoted to showing the Jews that he was with them. And he was, until he wasn't. And then he kind of abandoned them, and he ended up getting killed in a battle for the Seleucid Empire. So there's all these political turnover, and yet, for the most part, the Jewish identity is preserved. And I'll tell you why. It was because of well-intentioned men who said, we're going to study the law, and we're going to seek as a people to live according to the law. That's what we're going to do. Well, as this process went on during these years, eventually there's going to become differences over not what the law says, but how the law is interpreted. So, all of a sudden there's a split in the Sanhedrin between two primary factions of people. One group of people was basically made up of middle-class persons. They were shopkeepers, they were merchants, they were what you and I would call common people. The other group was mostly autocrats. They really liked their position. They believed that, specifically one of the dividing factors was they believed that anybody that had a claim to the high priesthood had to be a marked descendant from Zadok, the high priest, which might have been where they actually got their name from. When you take the name Zadok, and you don't have to alter it very much to get Sadducee. And so this was the Sadducees. They were very rich people, like I said, very autocratic. They had some interesting beliefs. They did not believe that there was an afterlife. They did not believe that there was any judgment in a next life. They certainly did not believe in a resurrection. But they really bore down on this right, proper line to the priesthood. Okay. The other group was, they were pretty rigid too. They were actually very strict as well. But since the rabbinical system ultimately kind of traced to this group and this thought, there were rabbis along the way that wrote a lot of things down in regards to interpretation of the Old Testament law. And this group came to believe that God not only gave to Moses his written law, but that God also orally communicated to Moses how to interpret the law. And that this oral interpretation had been passed down from Moses to this person, to this person, to this person, to this person. And those things would be ultimately written down in another book. And by the way, this book is still used in the rabbinical Jewish system, and it's called the Talmud. And the Talmud is the rabbinical record of the oral interpretation that God gave to Moses that was passed down. And so this group decided we've got the written law of God, and then we've got the oral law of God, which was God telling Moses how to interpret the written law of God. And so among this group, things really got mixed up. And so during this intertestamental period, there were two rabbis that kind of rose up in the scene, both very, very studied, both very, very smart men. One man's name was Shammai. The other man's name was Hillel. And they basically represented opposing ideas for the way that the Old Testament law would be interpreted. And of course, each one of them started a school to teach future rabbis their thinking and their interpretations and their way of thought. Well, among this group, it got to where the students of Shammai and the students of Hillel could not even worship God together because of how vastly different they were in their opinions and things like that. But there was one thing they agreed on. They agreed about what sect of Judaism they followed, and that would be the Pharisees. Both Shammai and Hillel were Pharisees, very prominent Pharisees. And so by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, we know that the Pharisees are talked about a lot in Scripture. And these Pharisees were divided among themselves, among the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And one thing they loved to do was just sit around and talk about their differences and argue and debate and fuss and fight. But then they also had the responsibility of settling civil cases and really one thing that's kind of interesting about this part in history, if you don't know this would be a good thing to know. Israel has been responsible throughout its existence for bringing a lot of good things into the world. And one thing that they brought into the world was the type of legal system that our legal system in the United States is based upon. They're one of the first people in history to practice what would be called case law or precedent law, where you would look back at former cases and precedents that were established based on past interpretations and interpret future situations like that. And we still are supposed to practice that in the United States. Some decisions nowadays made in courts are, I think we could say, unprecedented and maybe biased. And certainly not according to the Constitution, but I won't get into all that. So you have this group of the Pharisees and you have the Sadducees. Now the Sadducees were in existence the whole time the Pharisees were, but they never had quite the power or authority, and it was really because of their attitude. They were just so far above people. And while the Pharisees were too, the Pharisees did so in the name of righteousness. But the Pharisees made it an attainable form of righteousness, so that anybody could come to them with questions and they would say, well, here's the answer to your question, and this is how you can be righteous. So while both groups of these leaders were self-righteous, the Pharisees just made a passion out of it. And so there's things in the Scripture that when Jesus comes on the scene, we find him constantly addressing. Now, this is going to help us understand some New Testament things here. At least I know it did me, to study why these Pharisees existed, what their role was, because they weren't really political leaders. They were just civil judges and things like that. And yet they held positions of power. They were able to sway political leaders in their time. And here's why: because they had the respect and the approval of the people. That's really what gave them their power and authority, was they had the following of the people. And so here's this group, they're very self-assured, and they've got everything figured out when it comes to civil law, religious law. People got problems. They go to the civil court. They go to the lower Sanhedrin. They go to the great Sanhedrin. This is how their matters are settled. Until one day, there's a man on a hillside. And multitudes are going to him. This clicking here? You got hundreds of years, at least 170 years, where they've been the deciders on all matters. They've controlled political leaders above them. They've steered the ship. And while they didn't agree amongst themselves, that wasn't really a problem. But it was just that they had this means of control that the people respected them, and everybody came to them for leadership. And boy, if you could climb that ladder, you were somebody. As a matter of fact, our Bible tells us about somebody who climbed that ladder. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. As touching the law, he was a Pharisee. He sat in the school of Gamaliel, another prominent rabbi. And this is what he came to. That after he came to know Jesus, all that was counted but dung. It didn't make any difference. Because without Jesus, he was nothing. Of course, I'm talking about the Apostle Paul. So Jesus comes onto the scene. He's taken to the temple for dedication. And there's people in the temple that want to hold him. And not because the people always want to hold little babies, especially when they're about 8 days old. But no, there's people that want to hold him, pray over him, and bless him because he's the salvation of the people, and they've seen this by revelation from God. This has got to get the attention of a few. There's wise men from the east that show up and ask the political leader, where is he who is born King of the Jews? And Herod didn't know anything about this. So who does he go to? Well, he goes to these others, these scribes, these men who can give him an answer. No doubt in my mind, he goes to the Sanhedrin. So what about this? They say, well, yes, we are looking for a Messiah, and the Bible says he's supposed to come here, and so all of a sudden Herod's thinking, King of the Jews, huh? And he's got all of his paranoia issues. But he's not going to be the only one. Because Herod's going to die, and the next leader's going to lose power. Pontius Pilate is going to become a prefect or a governor over this territory. And guess who's knocking at his door? That's Sanhedrin. This group of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Because as far as I can find in historical study, the only thing the Pharisees and Sadducees ever got along about was that this man has got to go. And here's why. Because all men go unto him. All of a sudden, they see their position slipping away. Let me remind you that when they came about, it wasn't about position, power, leadership, dynasty, all of that kind of stuff. It was about maintaining Jewish identity. But it had a way of becoming something else. But you know what? Here's the thing. None of that was an accident to God. Because God already knew that for his plan to be accomplished, Jesus had to die. So prophecy said that Jesus had to come to his people as their Messiah, but prophecy also said that he had to die on a cross. Those were prophecies going all the way back to the book of Psalms. Psalm chapter 22 and further. There's these prophecies of cursed is every man that hangs from a tree. And so God had been lining up all these prophecies. Well, how the Jews are looking for their Messiah. How is their Messiah going to come and then Him die? Well, He's actually going to come and He's going to die at the hands of His own people. And how is that? How can that be? Well, it wasn't that the populace hated Jesus. It wasn't that the populace of Judea and Israel was full of animosity toward Jesus. That's why there were multitudes of people that followed Him. That's why he would feed 5,000 at one point and 4,000. And those are just the men. We don't know total if women and children were involved or what. But some suspect that in the feeding of the 5,000 there might have actually been more like 10,000 that he fed. But I'm telling you, all of this just added up and added up and added up to being hated, not by the individual Jewish people, but by this group of leaders that were so threatened that people were going to Him. And His interpretations of the law were different than theirs. When they would talk and try to come to a consensus on things, it didn't go well for them. They would ask Him a question. And by the way, the Bible even reveals this. Most of the time that they would ask Him a question, they would do so to trap Him. They would do so to ensnare Him in speaking against Moses or in speaking against the law. But you're talking about the Son of God who gave the law. He knows how to give answer. And He did, masterfully, time and time again. And often the answers that He gave would just simply make them look foolish. It would just make them look that much worse. As a matter of fact, this started early. Do y'all remember this? He was 12. Went into the temple. And where's he at? He's talking to these guys. He's having a doctrinal discussion. And they're going, wow. This kid understands the Word. You think that had anything to do with the fact that He is the Word? And they were just confounded by that. But they really didn't know that 18 years later He was going to show back up. They definitely didn't know that these same Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders are going to set up a shop in the outer court of the Gentiles in the temple and sell sacrifices for temple money. They didn't expect that Jesus would come in and make a scourge out of cords and drive the animals and them out of the temple and overturn the tables and say, my Father's house is a house of prayer and you've turned it into a den of thieves. That didn't gain Him a lot of favor. And yet, how many times does the Bible tell us that they handled Him so delicately because they had one thing and one thing only to fear? I'm going to tell you right now, they didn't fear Jesus. They didn't fear His miracles. Do you remember what they feared? They feared the people. Because the people were all they had. They didn't have political power. They didn't have political leadership. These are a group of people that had to act boldly and yet tiptoe under Roman prefects and Roman rule. They were so insecure about their position, their authority. But the one thing they were sure of was their teaching, and they were happy to settle the matters of anybody. And yet, how many times did Jesus and even John the Baptist point out their own hypocrisy? That they taught for commandment the doctrines of men. They studied too much the Talmud, the book of the interpretations of the law, and too little the law itself. And there are times where this is pointed out. I'm going to have you turn with me to Mark chapter 7, if you would please. Mark chapter 7 and verse number 6. Mark chapter 7, verse number 6. This is when Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees here. Verse number 6, the Bible says, He answered and said unto them, Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things ye do. So they set their own standard of personal righteousness for themselves and for others, and believed that by ceremoniously washing their pots correctly and doing it the right way and their cups and things like that, that they were righteous and in favor with God because of the things they do. Look at Matthew chapter 9 with me. We're going to look at a few scriptures here, all pretty close proximity to each other, but Matthew chapter 9. Verse number 11, Matthew chapter 9, verse number 11. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto his disciples, Why eateth your master with publicans and sinners? But when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. But go ye and learn what that meaneth. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. For I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Verse number 14. Then came to him the disciples of John, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not? And Jesus gives them an answer to that question using the example of a bridegroom and a wedding feast and things like that. But even the disciples of John, having come out of that whole system, were still influenced by the outward expressions of religion and not the reality of who Jesus was as a person. Look at Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. I'm not going to go into this whole story, but this is a story of the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're making issues out of things again. And he says in verse number, let me just read this part. Verse number 1. Matthew chapter 15, verse number 1. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which are of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. But he answered and said unto them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother, and him that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, Whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, It is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus have ye made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Now, Jesus is specifically referring to a rabbinical interpretation of the law of honor thy father and thy mother, to where there was a loophole that a rabbi had put in that law that said, look, if you receive a gift from somebody else, then you're not obligated to use that gift to take care of somebody like your parents, your aged parents, or something like that. So you can declare that a gift, and then if mom and dad need something, you can say, well, I know I have this, but it was a gift, and so I'm not obligated to use that for them. That just sounds like a legal loophole, doesn't it? But what about the spirit of the law? The spirit of the law is that a person ought to acknowledge who it is that gave them life and have a desire to care for them and provide dignity for them in their aging years, regardless of how God provides the resources. So he points that out to them. Verse 7, ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draweth nigh to me with their mouth and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Same story there as Mark chapter 7. Look at Matthew chapter 23 finally. Matthew chapter 23. Follow along here. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now, I want to point out here to you that Jesus says, hey, not everything about these men is bad. Because one thing they did was, in their synagogues, in their rabbinical schools, they did read the law. They did hold to the law. They tried to maintain a Jewish identity around the law. And Jesus acknowledges that. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. In other words, if they read it to you from the law, then observe that. But watch this. But do not ye after their works. For they say and do not. We get a phrase from that right there. You know what it is? They don't practice what they preach. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be not ye called Rabbi. For one is your master, even Christ. And all ye are brethren. And call no man your father upon the earth. For one is your Father, which is in heaven. Now, personally, it might have been. I haven't found a historical practice in Israel where they called leaders Father. It wouldn't surprise me if the Lord didn't say that for that moment, but maybe about 300 years down the road. Verse number 10. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe unto you, ye blind guides! which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing, but whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar, sweareth by it and by all things thereon. And whosoever shall swear by the temple, sweareth by it and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven, sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. According to Old Testament law, both a gnat and a camel would be unclean to eat. So Jesus kind of paints a picture of their manner here when he says, you've got routine ways where when you're going to take a drink of water, you make sure you strain it so no gnat happens to wash down your throat into your body, but you don't even realize that by the way you're living, by your attitude, by your spirit, you're eating camel while you're straining gnats. Verse 25, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because ye build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Wherefore ye bear witnesses unto yourself that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers. How can ye escape the damnation of hell? Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them ye shall scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barchias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets, and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. That's pretty bold, isn't it? See, in Matthew chapter 23, it wasn't going to be very long before Jesus left the earth. And he was going to make a very bold statement to the Pharisees, but understand this, Jesus spoke this to the multitudes. He wanted them to understand the Jewish identity can no longer be about what the Pharisees and Sadducees have become. The Jewish identity needs to be about their Messiah, their Christ, their Master, and He's all you need. You say, I read that and I read a scathing rebuke. And I would agree, it's there. But I tell you what, you can also read that and see a clear gospel message. You can see the Son of God saying, I'm all you need. Oh, and by the way, how often would I have gathered you together? Yeah. Heavenly Father, I do thank you for your word. And God,